Okay, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to first thank everyone for tuning in to today's webinar to learn about climate planning in Colorado. My name is Logan Sand. I'm a Recovery and Resilience Planner with the Colorado Department of Local Affairs and the Division of Local Government. Today's webinar is going to be the third in the 2017 Planning for Hazards series that we've been putting on and hosting through each quarter. The webinar will be recorded and it will be posted to the Planning for Hazards website at planningforhazards.com shortly after our presentation today. So today I'm joined by Taryn Findesy. She's the Senior Climate Change Specialist for the Department of Natural Resources in the Colorado Water Conservation Board. I'm also lucky enough to be joined by Lindsay X, who's the Climate Program Manager for the City of Fort Collins, and Katie Bigner, who's an Environmental Planner and Project Coordinator for the City of Fort Collins as well. Just really quickly, I'm going to provide just a quick overview of what we're covering today. I'll talk about the Planning for Hazards Land Use Solutions Guide for Colorado, and then we'll dive into climate change in Colorado and get to some climate action planning in the City of Fort Collins and hear what they've been doing. So really quickly, I hope by the end of today's webinar that you'll have learned more about what the role of the planner is and the local government, your local government in climate planning in Colorado. And you'll have a better understanding of what some of the tools and resources are that are available to your community in order to take actions to reduce risk to various climate-related hazards. I also hope that you'll learn some tips and strategies for developing and implementing your own climate action plan, and that you'll be able to identify strategies for communicating climate science and integrating hazards planning into your current community planning efforts. So, diving right into the Planning for Hazards Guide, one of the resources that's available to local governments and planners. Just for some quick context, after the 2012-2013 floods and fires that caused over $5 billion in damages across the state of Colorado, the Department of Local Affairs worked with the Federal Emergency Management Association, FEMA, other state agency partners, local governments, and technical subject matter experts to create the Planning for Hazards Land Use Solutions for Colorado guide and website. And the guide is really designed to help inform local governments' long-term recovery efforts and to help communities be proactive in planning to reduce risk. The guide really focuses on how to identify what those community risks are to any number of Colorado hazards and to help select and implement the right land use solutions, strategies, and tools to make your community safer. The Planning for Hazard Guide was also initiated through the development of the State of Colorado's Colorado Resiliency Framework, and the guide was published in early 2016 and was funded with a U.S. Housing and Urban Development Community Development Block Grant for disaster recovery. So just really quickly, this is what the interface of the Planning for Hazards website looks like. I would just strongly encourage that if you have a chance and you are considering climate action planning, that you check out some of the other tools that have to do with land use planning that are available on the website. And currently there are about 27 planning tools and strategies, many of which include model land use code that can be tailored to your community. And for each tool that you look at, you can also find out how it works, what hazards it addresses, how to implement it, where it's been done, some of the advantages and key talking points, other key facts like what's the administrative capacity, maintenance of the tool or strategy, and some of the regulatory requirements, etc. And you also can find out some of what the practical challenges are for implementing and taking action with some of those land use planning tools. And of course, one of the planning tools that is available on the website is the Climate Action Plan or Climate Plan, as seen on this slide. Currently, there are some local governments in Colorado that have some really good examples, which include the City of Aspen, City and County of Denver, as well as the City of Fort Collins, which we're going to hear about here later. But either way, I encourage you all to take a look at the Planning for Hazards resource and share it and see if it has other tools that might be applicable and useful in your community, in your local government. So from there, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Taryn to get right into what we're seeing in climate change across Colorado.
Great, thanks. Can you all hear me?
Yep, coming loud and clear.
All right, and Logan, I just lost connectivity, and now I'm not seeing my slide or the advanced things on the bottom of the screen. It is connected, but you might have to drive.
Okay, I'm driving right now.
All right, thanks. So as Logan said, I am the Senior Climate Change Specialist for the state of Colorado. I'm housed within the Department of Natural Resources and the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And I just want to give you a brief overview of what climate change means for the state of Colorado and what we are doing, what we've done thus far to plan for it and incorporate it into our multitude of planning processes already underway. So as many of you are aware, Colorado is a land of extremes. We have been, and we will continue to be. Floods, droughts, and wildfires are events that are not uncommon within the state of Colorado, and in extremely unlucky years, such as 2013, we can have all three happen in one single year. Next slide, please. So we have warmed as a state, and this is, remember this is a statewide number, so it's distributed. It's not distributed equally across the state, but we have warmed 2 degrees in the last 30 years and 2.5 in the last 50. We are expected to warm an additional 2 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century, and you can see kind of what that would look like going forward. To help put it in context, it means that the warmest years of our past, think 2002, 2012, would be a much more typical year in the future. Next slide, please. And we have had 3 of the 5 warmest years just since 2012. And the water year, which runs from October through September, just concluded the 2017 water year, and that shook out to be the 3rd warmest water year on record. So we'll see how 2017 shapes out once we round out the calendar year. This year is looking at calendar years rather than water years. Next slide. So to put that in context, I mean, you think 2 to 6 degrees, no big deal. I mean, that's like we have 30-degree fluctuations from morning to afternoon in Colorado. It was 80 degrees yesterday. It's going to be a high of 50 today. Temperature fluctuations are not something that is uncommon for us. But when you're thinking about average annual temperature changes and increases, it means something much different. So think what a 2-degree warming in Denver might mean is that we would become more like Pueblo. 4 degrees of Fahrenheit warming, our seasonal temperatures would become much more similar to that of Lamar out in the southeastern corner of the state. And at 6 degrees Fahrenheit, we actually have to go outside the bounds of the state of Colorado to have a comparison, a good comparison in Albuquerque. Next slide. As far as precipitation, the models are much more uncertain. Models generally are not very good at predicting precipitation in mid-latitude areas with diverse topography and in landlocked states, which is Colorado on all 3 counts. And so any future annual change in precipitation will probably be hard to tease out against the variability that already exists within the state of Colorado. We are more confident that to the north of us it will get wetter, to the south of us it will get drier, but we are kind of just right on the line where the models are not really good at predicting it. We don't have a lot of faith in the indications that they're giving because we just can't tease out what change in precipitation might be attributed to climate change versus the natural variability that exists within the state. And as I said at the beginning, we are a land of extremes, and variability is kind of embedded in our history and will continue to be part of our future. Next slide. So those temperature changes and even the precipitation changes are not distributed equally across the months of the year. What we know from looking at the science and the models that exist right now is that we are much more likely to warm more in the summer months, less in the winter months, and with precipitation, we would see more precipitation in the winter months and less in the summer months. So that can be problematic if you're a farmer or a rancher looking to use precipitation to help aid your crops, especially if you're a dryland farmer. But it's also when municipalities usually see an uptick in demand for their own water. So that presents a problem. And snow is our largest reservoir, but if our shoulder seasons are warming, then that becomes a less reliable reservoir. If we're going to see, actually go to the next slide, Logan. So here are some of the trends we have seen thus far, and you'll notice that we're seeing lower snow on water equivalent and earlier peak runoff. This is independent of other phenomenons like dust on snow that also result in an additional 1 to 3 weeks of early snow melt, but we're seeing about a month earlier of our peak runoff timing. That's indicative of the warmer temperatures on those shoulder seasons. And then an increase in drought, a decrease in frost-free seasons in some areas. If you're in the Gunnison Valley and you have access to water, but you have a really short growing season, there may be benefits that come to this as well. I think it's really important when looking at a warming climate to not just focus on the doom and gloom, but also to recognize that there's adaptation strategies that can be advantageous as well. And Logan, my arrows just came back, so I can drive now.
Got it.
So what do we expect to see going forward? Well, more rain and less snow in those shoulder seasons due to warmer temperatures, reduced spring snowpack, again because of the warmer temperatures, earlier snow melt and peak runoff will continue. And reduced annual flows. We don't know what's going to happen with regard to precipitation in Colorado, but we do know that warming is significant enough of a driver that you would have to have a substantial increase in precipitation to overcome the decrease in water availability as a result of higher evaporation and evapotranspiration that would occur. Because of that higher evaporation, we see reduced soil moisture in the summer months, longer and more severe drought impacts, but also a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. So when it does rain, it's very likely that we would see more intense heavy precipitation events. And again, Colorado is a land of extremes to begin with. We have a lot of risks that affect this state already. It depends where in the state you are as to what those risks are. And climate change is not going to introduce new risks so much as multiply the risks that already exist. So droughts may become more intense and severe. We may see more intense and severe wildfires. When we have heavy precipitation events, they may be heavier. That may result in a more frequent occurrence of landslides. And so think of climate change as just a threat multiplier. So what are we doing about this? Given all that climate change touches, which is virtually all aspects of our economy and our society, how are we thinking about planning for this, given that there is also a great deal of uncertainty embedded in the models? We know that all models are wrong and some are useful. We have high confidence in the warming numbers, but not as much confidence in the precipitation. And there's still a big range of what we might see, and a lot of that is dependent upon our actions today as to what we will see in the future. So how do you plan for something that is so uncertain, but also so impactful? Well, in Colorado, for our water resource planning, we actually rely on scenario planning. And the idea is that in the past, we planned assuming the future was going to look like the past, and we had kind of one finite future that we expected to happen. Climate change challenges that notion, and so we no longer plan for just one future, but instead a range of futures. With decision points along the way, as we get more information on what trajectory we are falling on, we can shift and adjust so that our planning processes are more adaptable and nimble, and we can be prepared for whatever future may unfold. So that's what we're doing within water resources, and I think it has a lot of applicability outside of just water resources. Now, we also have a lot of other resiliency efforts going on at the state. And this is kind of one of the core graphics from the Colorado Resiliency Framework that looks at all the different sectors involved, which arguably are the sectors of each and every one of your local communities, societies, and economies. And so I just want to show you, because I often get the question, well, how does climate change interact with the things that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis? So I just want to kind of go through how climate change overlays with some of these sectors. So we've got the warming that impacts infrastructure and community and natural resources. It impacts our economy and our agriculture. Changes in stream flow also can have an impact on tourism. If peak runoff is occurring before kids get out of school, then that has an impact on the rafting community. Communities are heavily reliant on tourism and RAC dollars in some areas of the community. Droughts and increased temperatures can lead to lower quality water, lower quality air, as well as putting stress on our natural resources. Heat and stress, heat-related stress can affect not only people and livestock and other animals, but also our infrastructure. It can result in droughts, and wildfires can result in massive infrastructure changes. Reduced availability of water. You know, Colorado is a semi-arid state to begin with. We only get about 14 inches of rain on average across the state. And so that has implications for our agriculture, for our municipalities, for our wildlife, for our energy, all the way across the board. Pathogens and vector-borne diseases are a concern with climate change. Obviously, those have cross-cutting issues across a multitude of sectors. Air quality and water quality, especially on the Front Range, where we already have an air quality non-attainment zone. This can be a great challenge. Warmer water can hold more stuff and needs to be accounted for in treatment processes that can often drive up water treatment processes. And then there's huge mental health and social impacts of extreme weather events. I think we're seeing this play out as a result of the hurricanes right now. And then decreased water availability. We only have so much water in the state of Colorado, and there's a lot of demand for it. We're not yet actually able to meet all of those demands to their fullest as is. If we see a decrease in water going forward, that will continue to be a large stress. So what resources are available for you all to start incorporating climate change into your planning and decision making? And I really do encourage climate change to just be another layer of decision making. You would never make a decision for a municipality based on information that lacks population or economic. And so why not just add climate change as another layer to that? Perhaps it changes your decision making. Perhaps it doesn't. If it doesn't, you know that you're making robust decisions that will put you on a better standing in the future. So there's a number of federal resources that exist, and we're really lucky here in Colorado to have a number of federal agencies and research centers housed right within our state, and with folks who are really vested in the well-being of the future of Colorado. And so I'll mention a few of these right now. NIDIS, from the drought standpoint, is based at NOAA in Boulder. This is the National Integrated Drought Information System that has a lot of historical information on precipitation and temperature, as well as agriculture and ecosystems. The National Center for Environmental Information, NCEI, used to be NCDC, has been rebranded in the last couple of years, has just an obscene amount of information on weather and climate. You can drive down into individual stations. You can see how how your community's temperature has shifted and changed over time. And then there is both USDA and USGS have climate centers within the state of Colorado. USDA has the Northern Plains Climate Health based in Fort Collins, and then the USGS has the North Central Climate Science Center, also based at CSU in Fort Collins. And these focus on ag and ecosystems, really science-based decision-making is really important to them. And then Western Water Assessment, which is one of 9 regional integrated science assessment teams in the nation. It's housed at CU Boulder. They've done a lot of work on water and climate vulnerability. They've looked a lot at fires and the impact of pathogens. And so there's a lot of information here at the federal level that can be integrated into your long-term planning at the community level. At the state level, we also have put out a Climate Change in Colorado report. This is really just a synthesis of the science and information for what climate change means for Colorado and some of the adaptation practices that can be utilized. It was originally put out for water providers, but we keep getting more and more feedback that it has a much broader reaching audience than that. The Colorado Climate Change Vulnerability Study is a qualitative assessment across all sectors of what climate change could mean for Colorado, and again includes some of the practices to plan for that. Our state drought plan is one of the only state drought plans in the nation that incorporates climate change into it and analyzes what climate change could mean for drought in Colorado. It's done on a county-by-county basis and includes a qualitative and quantitative vulnerability study in that. Certainly any of that information could be utilized within your local communities. And then annually, as part of House Bill 13-1293, we provide a legislative update to the a climate update to the legislature on what is happening across all state agencies on climate change and what we are doing to address it, both from the mitigation and the adaptation standpoint.
Taryn, we have about 5 minutes.
Yep, I see that. Thanks. So I also want to talk about a couple local efforts that are going on. The Compact of Colorado Communities is a new initiative that kicked off in May with 21 cities and counties passing resolutions that commit themselves to climate action. They're really focused on building capacity and that knowledge exchange, reaching goals, and working collaboratively to achieve those goals. And what is true is that for the state to achieve our goals, we must also support the local governments and help them achieve their goals. So in July of this year, Governor Hickenlooper issued an executive order setting forth climate or greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and goals for the state, both economy-wide at 26% by 2025, as well as across the utility sector or the electricity sector, and then looking at demand. We are working rapidly to implement this, but one of the things that we are doing as a result of that executive order is actually co-hosting a symposium on climate change with the Compact of Colorado that will be held January 31st and February 2nd in Aurora. This is a 2 to 3 day event in which we are really going to be focusing on that capacity building and how to incorporate and prepare for climate change, focusing on best practices and that knowledge exchange going forward so that we can achieve the vision for Colorado that we really hope will be our future. We're also recognizing that Colorado is an energy-producing state and that the global shift in the energy economy, largely driven by market forces, is impacting some of our communities that are relying upon more traditional energy development. And so we are working really closely with those communities to help support them. DOLA has hired a full-time staff member based on the West Slope to address this issue. Some of these communities have recently received funds as a result of an Obama-era program to help these communities, and that will help them going forward as well. But this is an ongoing effort. There's obviously a lot of strings that interconnect here that we're working to make sure these communities maintain their economic vitality. And then we are also updating the Colorado Climate Plan. It's currently out for public comment. There's a lot of additional resources in this for local communities, both on the mitigation and adaptation side. We're taking public comment on this until November 3rd, and that is up on our website as well for CWCB as well as the Department of Natural Resources. And then I want to also say that I know across Colorado we are a deeply purple state, and climate change can sometimes be a contentious issue. But there's been some recent polling done in which the vast majority of adults actually support regulating CO2 as a pollutant. And folks are worried and concerned about climate change. And if you ask them this question a slightly different way as to whether or not they are worried for future generations, this number actually ticks up pretty substantially. But unfortunately, no one's talking about climate change. And I think that this is in part because it's a complex issue. It's historically been a really contentious issue, and so people avoid the topic. But I also think some communities just feel like this is a topic they can't talk about. And I would really encourage folks, rather than not having these tough discussions, to think about different ways to have the discussion. I started off this presentation talking about how we are a land of extremes and how climate change will multiply the risk of those extremes. And I think that that's a really good way to have that conversation about resilience in each and every one of your communities. So rather than avoiding the topic completely, just think about different ways to communicate it with audiences that may be a little bit more skeptical going forward. And hopefully we can all gain some confidence in how prepared we will be in the future. And with that, I think I'm done.
Thanks, Taryn. Katie and Lindsay, you guys are up.
Thanks so much, Logan, for organizing, and Tara for that great introduction. This is Lindsay X with the City of Fort Collins. With me today, as you heard earlier, is Katie Bigner, also with Fort Collins. And we are going to share a little bit about our story and our journey here in Fort Collins around climate action, and how in some ways we've made it easier for us to talk about it, going back to what Taryn was just speaking to, and also how we really are driving toward results as well. And so we'll do a little bit about Fort Collins, our commitment and our progress, speaking specifically about mitigation and adaptation as well. And we're going to spend a bit of time talking about what you all can do as well. I come from, been with the city for 7 years now, and my first 5 years were with the planning department, implementing our land use code and our comprehensive plan every day. So happy, especially in Q&A, to get into more specifics if it's helpful. So I think before we even dive into Fort Collins at all, we should talk about why cities and why planners when we're thinking about climate change. We often in Fort Collins talk about how 70% of the emissions globally come from cities. And that is an important piece for us as planners to think about, because when we think about these emissions that are occurring within cities, we actually have some of the biggest and greatest, most impactful levers that we can pull on climate work. So we are the ones that are affecting our land use systems. We are the ones that are affecting the transportation systems within our communities. We are the ones that are working on building codes, on our land use codes. We have a lot of opportunity as planners to influence these broader, what can sometimes feel like aspirational goals that also feel like they're global challenges and not really here in my community. For context, I think that we do, speaking back to what Taryn was talking to earlier about some people being able to speak to this, some people not being able to speak to this. For context, I think that there's a couple of different approaches out there around how people are talking about climate. And the one on the left is one of, I think, for folks in this world, I think it's one of our favorite cartoons about, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world all for nothing? And this is really what I would call sort of a no regrets approach to acting on climate. And this is something that Fort Collins really initially aligned with in our work when we've been working on this since the 1990s. Others may have a different perspective, and so really thinking about climate work, how it best fits for your community is really important. Going specifically onto Fort Collins, I know many of you know where we are, but I'll share a couple of stats about us as well. Our current population is 160,000, and like many of our Colorado communities, we are expected to have pretty significant growth increases over the next 30 years. And one of our greatest challenges is how we continue to preserve that small town feel that we all love about Fort Collins, even as we reach some of these larger populations. We also are home to CSU, which represents about 20% of our population, and we are a council manager form of government. And one of Fort Collins' greatest advantages in this space is that we are a municipal utility, and that we work very closely with our wholesale provider, Platte River, and the 3 other communities to advance our goals. And like many of you, we were talking earlier about how we're a purple state. Fort Collins is also in the middle of U.S. moderate politics. Our president of our chamber has said that we're a community that likes to play within the 40-yard lines. And it's a reference that can resonate with a lot of you in your communities across Colorado as well. And we also have a lot to celebrate here as far as our commitment to multimodal accessibility in our community. So Fort Collins has been working in this space for quite some time. We actually adopted our first emissions goals back in 1999. And again, it was under that framework of no regrets. What do we lose if we do this? And then in 2008, we adopted what's now sort of considered the industry standard around emission reduction goals of what you might have heard it as 80 by 50. And in 2015, recognizing the increasing threat of not acting on climate quickly enough, our community via our council unanimously adopted a carbon neutrality goal by 2050, and we moved up our 80% reduction goal by a full 2 decades ahead of most of our peers. The good news is that Fort Collins has made progress on our goals, and we are now 12% below our 2005 levels. But as you can see with those lines, the curves continue to get steeper to where we need to go. What we often talk about is how we've reduced emissions, but we often don't pair that up with the fact that our population has already grown by 25% since 2005, and our gross municipal product is up about 30%. So I think the good news is that you can decouple carbon reductions from the economy because it can be an and proposition. We can grow our economy and do that while preserving our environment and increasing quality of life. I think it's important to put some of this climate work into perspective too, and just want to briefly highlight what we track in Fort Collins. So our inventory, which we do conduct on an annual basis, looks at electricity, natural gas, ground travel, solid waste, and water. And when we're thinking about our work, we recognize that almost all of it, 95% of our emission goals are going to be addressed through transportation and energy use. And so we're going to highlight a little bit of that today. We talk about how we're going to get to our goals, and we're focused quite a bit on our 2020 goals right now. And the significant part of our pathway to 2020 will be energy, as well as with transportation and in waste. And as I mentioned earlier, we are already 12% toward that goal, but you can see, again, we have much work to do. So Taryn mentioned earlier about the energy transformation that Colorado is going to go through, and this is the way that we frame it in Fort Collins, that we're really moving from the graphic on the left to the graphic on the right, where really the power delivery was just that. It was coming from the plant to the home, and it was really a one-way proposition. And now in a new system, in the new energy transformation, in a new energy economy, whatever term you want to use, it's really a bi-directional delivery of power. And you hear it often talked about as a distributed energy system. And you can see in the graphic on the right that we're also leveraging additional sources of energy as well. So I just want to touch base really briefly on a couple of these different sectors that we were talking about that could influence our 2020 and beyond goals. So we're going to show 3 slides on energy, waste reduction, and transportation. From an energy side, when we're talking about climate action in communities, we're largely talking about it in 2 different ways. How are we going to increase or clean up our energy portfolio from a supply perspective? The example on the left is a community solar garden that Fort Collins installed, and that it was sold out before it even went online, which is an example of the kind of potential for pent-up demand that's already in your community. And then energy efficiency, many communities in Colorado have hit build-out already, and we need to be thinking about how we improve the efficiency of our existing buildings, as well as when redevelopment occurs, how do we improve the efficiency of those through building codes. Waste reduction, a couple of different thoughts on this one, but really what's it going into your landfill? What do you need to be planning for, and how do you, essentially the old standard of reduce, reuse, recycle. So from a reduction perspective, which is where a lot less of many communities' focus have been on, we are definitely talking about how we address consumerism and the consumption of materials. But I think a lot of our communities have really been focusing on recycling, right? And we have a Timberline Recycling Center, which is the picture on the right, and that is something that over 40% of our residents take advantage of, even while we have curbside recycling that 95% of our residents take advantage of. We've also set some very aspirational goals when it comes to waste reduction, and we're aiming to be zero waste community by 2030. In the transportation systems that we are thinking about, we're really thinking about how do we leverage our existing systems that we already have in Fort Collins to increase our multimodal use of our landscape. So how do we get people out of single occupancy vehicles? We're talking a lot about the sharing economy, certainly all across Colorado. Bike share is coming out, car sharing, that type of work. And for the first time, we are really looking through our comprehensive planning update that's kicking off just this month on how we really integrate some of our climate goals with our transportation and land use planning scenarios. So in many communities as land use planners, you know when you're looking at the traffic counts for a new development, every single one of those counts is increasing. Well, what if we're breaking those models and we're going from 160,000 to 250,000 while decreasing our VMTs? These are the types of challenges that we're going to be working on in the coming years. I think it's important to note that because this work touches almost every single department in our city, we have really developed an internal infrastructure to leading in this space as well. And you can see, of course, the community is at the base of everything we do related to climate. Our council is the one that's focused on the vision. They're the ones that adopt the goals. But the 3 icons on the right, I just want to spend a moment on that. That includes our executive leadership, so our deputy city manager, our chief sustainability officer sitting right next to our CFO on a biweekly basis. And that integrates all the way down to the line level through the strategic initiative teams that are working on those issues that are going to directly impact our goals, like energy and transportation, to those that are more supporting needs like messaging and engagement. We are using very traditional planning strategies that you all use on a very daily basis. We're engaging staff across the city early, we're engaging them often, and we're really working on what's that grassroots or bottom-up approach to developing the initiatives that will get us to our goal. So how do we really enable ownership across the city? And it's also got to be external too, so that's why we have a community advisory committee, and we include 14 leaders from across the city that really bring a triple bottom line perspective to the work that we do. And we call this our leadership at every level model. And as planners, and in all the work that we're doing, whether you're in local government or you're in the private sector, we often talk about the silos that we work in. And I just want to sort of dispense with the myth that climate action planning is its own silo or is something brand new. In Fort Collins, what we've done is we've really aligned our climate action plan work with every single policy or planning document that we're already working on. So our zero waste goals are aligned with our climate action plan. Our transportation master plan, as we were just talking about, it's aligned with our climate action plan. And really, if we achieve the goals that we've set forth in those various documents, we're achieving our climate action plan goals. And I bring this up specifically because I think for some communities out there that might be brand new in this space, it's important to know from a Where I Get Started perspective that many of you are already doing work in this space, even if you aren't using the words climate change or climate action or carbon neutrality or 80 by 50. Essentially, the work that we're doing is all related. And Tara mentioned earlier that there's different ways to have the discussion. When we were just down talking about this at APA Colorado, many community members came out to me at the end and said, you know, my community doesn't talk about climate change, but we're working on recycling and we're working on increasing biking in our community. So a lot of folks are already working in this space. So first off, just acknowledge that you are already doing this. And secondly, this is where it starts to get exciting, is the importance of goal setting in this work. Many folks, you can just adopt a universal target, or you could conduct an emissions inventory to see really where your efforts are coming from. But this is, unlike almost any other strategy that you could take on, goal setting is the one most strategic way that you can align resources around your goals. I heard this from our local startup recruitment organization, that when Fort Collins set its carbon neutrality goal, that was a way for them to begin recruiting businesses to come to Fort Collins that also had their values aligned with where we wanted to head from an economic perspective. So this is just really, it's an opportunity for you. And then thinking about what messaging is right for you in your community as well. Can share more about that in Q&A. So just one last thought on getting started before we transition to where we're at with adaptation. It's just to seek alignment in the work that you're doing. For planners that work on land use codes, thinking about, for example, from a waste perspective, do you require that when new developments are coming in, that they don't just create space for trash enclosures, but they also have space for recycling enclosures as well? When is that right for you? When you're thinking about some of those impacts that Taryn highlighted on a statewide basis earlier, does your land use code have water efficiency standards, and do you have a maximum water budget in your codes? Do you have species diversity, so if something like the emerald ash borer comes into your community, you're able to be resilient toward that potential impact? And align this work with your comprehensive plans as you're updating them as well. Taryn mentioned the Compact of Colorado Communities earlier. Fort Collins is also a part of Colorado Communities for Climate Action, and that is really a policy-focused organization. So we are working with 15 communities across the state to advance climate-related policies, because we know, both with the policy levers that we can pull as well as the capacity building levers that the Compact of Colorado Communities are working on, we're not going to reach our goals alone in Fort Collins. We need other Colorado communities to come along as well. And just quickly, I'll highlight that on the establishing an internal team, that many communities get started by focusing on themselves. So how can we improve our own municipal buildings, our own municipal fleet? That's a really easy way for many communities to get started. And I was just visiting with almost 200 other communities from across the country that are working on this earlier in the week in San Diego. And so many communities, especially small communities that I spoke with, mentioned that they started with themselves. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to Katie to speak about adaptation.
Great, thank you. My name is Katie Bigner. I'm an environmental planner here at the City of Fort Collins. I've been working on adaptation and resiliency issues with the city since 2008. So just to transition from talking about mitigation to where there's an intersection between mitigation and adaptation. And we often refer to mitigation as something that's really actions that reduce emissions that contribute to climate change, and it's often viewed as a scope that we have to do at a global level. But adaptation is really something that we're going to be experiencing in the local governments and the local communities. And really those are adaptations and actions that minimize and prevent the negative impacts from climate change. There are a lot of opportunities where these two intersect, and that could be things that we've already talked about, such as efficiency opportunities through both energy and water, things like tree planting and care, and a lot of the opportunities around energy use and how we choose to generate as well. So things that Taryn talked a little bit about related to how the community in Fort Collins will be impacted by climate change. And I realize not everyone's along the Front Range, so we all have a little bit of different certain hazards. But the way that we are looking at this is we are already experiencing these hazards. We have experienced them historically, and as Taryn mentioned, these are likely just to get worse in the future. So what can we do that we know would improve certain circumstances that we've experienced historically, and how can we minimize those impacts in the future with a warming climate and the things that may become worse in the future? There are things that we haven't experienced historically that will require some adjustments. Speaking just to extreme heat, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, that's not something that we've typically experienced historically. And depending on where if your community is growing like Fort Collins, you may have folks that are coming to the community that don't really know what our climate's like already and may not think it's hot. So it might be a hard argument, and it's going to require a lot of education to know that daytime highs are going to be warmer, things are going to be hotter consistently in the summer, and that it's going to have impacts even if we continue to have nighttime cooling, which is expected. So specific vulnerabilities and risks to city services. We don't currently have a community-wide adaptation plan, and the way that we've looked at and viewed adaptation strategies to date have been focused on reducing the risk and vulnerabilities to the services that we provide. Because we have 4 municipal utilities, water, wastewater, stormwater, and electric distribution, we have a lot of levers to pull related to providing those key services to the community. But things that we expect to see in terms of impacts from climate change are, some dramatic impacts to our infrastructure. The picture on the right of the Monroe water intake, that's just up the Poudre Canyon, and that's not actually caused from an extreme event. It's actually a post-event activity. So this mud and the sediment that clogged up our intake, which is where we get half of our water source, occurred after a post-fire flood. So there's cascading impacts that can occur from natural hazards. And then the other picture is Smoke in Town from the 2012 fire. This is something communities will be grappling with throughout the U.S. as wildfires pick up not only in our communities, in our region, but impacts from fires from all over the U.S. and Canada, as we've experienced previously. So we're looking at how we can maintain the quality of our key services, what the impacts are to our workforce, and then how do we continue to provide the quality and quantity of services based on impacts to the natural resources that we currently rely on. So what are some things that we're doing right now? And this is in lieu of a formal adaptation plan, which we're going to work on next year. But we do have 2 water sources for our drinking water supply, and we're taking a look at how those might be impacted, and including scenario-based planning based on climate change impacts in that. So we've got a water supply and vulnerability assessment that we're currently doing, and we're a recent emerging trend that we're looking at is how can we involve other departments and within Fort Collins Utilities to participate in that. Both our water supply planners as well as our stormwater planners are not currently using climate change modeling in their planning. But how can we use this as an opportunity to leverage this assessment to agree upon different scenarios and help bring along different departments that haven't used climate planning typically. We're also going to talk about conflicting practices. An example of that might be our forestry department plants a large number of trees annually, either through medians or through parks, and that can be in direct conflict with our water conservation goals. So that's one example of some tensions within our organization that we hope to address in the future. We're also going to do organization-wide employee policies related to air quality events, such as wildfire smoke in town. How can we address heat impacts for some of our services like recreation, where we may be hosting activities during these events and how do we manage those. And as I mentioned, we'll be developing a formal municipal adaptation plan in 2018. And we'll have an opportunity to update this in conjunction with our municipal sustainability goals. So just wanted to highlight this because this is something, as I mentioned, we haven't typically experienced in Fort Collins and many communities. That we did a study with the Rocky Mountain Climate Organization in 2013, and they highlighted both what the observed trends are related to hot days in Fort Collins and where they projected out into the future. And an important point and why we have spent so much energy focusing on mitigating climate change is this is a great illustration of this. These days and increases are based on a medium-high scenario. So the more that we can do to reduce emissions, both locally and globally, will help make things be, I guess in one way, is just it will reduce the impacts in the future. So we could look at less of these impacts versus more of them. And then moving forward, there's a lot of opportunities for things that you can do in your community. Lindsay and I are glad to be a resource for you if you have any questions outside of this webinar. But really just there's a lot of opportunity to set goals within your departments, align them as best as you can with your existing systems. It's really helpful if you can understand where your emission sources are to inform your strategies. And really supporting both energy and water efficiency are really important, particularly when you think about impacts from higher heat days that can impact and soar energy use or having a water-constrained future. And then just next steps for us, really we're going to have a pretty strong focus until 2020 on meeting our Climate Action Plan goals. We're also looking at ways to leverage opportunities that come out of our Climate Action Plan and adaptation strategy. We have a new position that's a climate economy advisor, and he's looking for opportunities for how to leverage both financing and as well as focus on how to improve both communication and assistance to our business community. We'll be looking at better ways to align our mitigation and adaptation, and then as Lindsay mentioned, we've got a great opportunity to align with our city plan, which is our comprehensive master plan, and then the transportation and transit plans that are also going to be occurring in conjunction with that update in 2018. So that's all we have. Thank you.
Great. First and foremost, thanks to all of our speakers, to Taryn, Katie, and Lindsay for showing your expertise and offering your support. Here's our contact information, but I do want to take a couple minutes. If you have any questions, please type them down in the bottom right-hand side of the screen in the chat box and take advantage of the time with the experts on the phone to ask them some questions. So if you have something that you're thinking of, please type it in now. We'll wait a few minutes and see what we get. So I guess in the meantime, while maybe someone's writing something, looks like Kathleen Donahue, are there funding or grants that you guys can share that are on the phone right now to help local governments diversify their energy sources, increase the amount of solar, wind systems that might be out there, et cetera? Anything you can share for communities that are considering building up a more diversified distribution system?
Taryn, do you want to start?
Sure. I can start by saying that we are actually starting at the state level to compile a host of all the resources that exist. Oftentimes, government websites are not the most easy to navigate, and finding resources that are available in different agencies can be arduous. And so as part of the local government efforts, we are actually compiling a resource toolbox that will be available beginning early next year on our resiliency website. And that will go agency by agency and outline the funding and the technical resources that exist for local government across all of the different agencies. So rather than sit here and kind of cherry pick a handful of them. I guess I'm just going to say stay tuned. That's coming. It'll be out in the next couple of months. And if you have specific questions between now and then, feel free to reach out to me.
Great, thanks. Looks like we have one question from Kathleen, and she's asking, what climate change-related mitigation actions have you been seeing in Colorado mitigation plans? So I don't know if, Taryn, you have some insight there. I can share that the Department of Homeland Security in the Colorado, the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management in the Department of Public Safety oversees all the hazard mitigation plans that counties and municipalities are involved in across the state. Kathleen, I can put you in touch with a couple folks there, and they might be able to give you some more specific actions. Taryn, I'm not sure if you have anything you want to add into that.
Sure. I mean, I think it depends on kind of which hazards people are focusing on and what makes sense for their communities. Out on the Eastern Plains, we're seeing a lot of energy efficiency work. We started a pilot program with the Energy Office in our Ag Department a couple of years ago. It's been expanded twice and is now statewide and across the whole ag sector. And so we're seeing a lot within the ag community where folks are trying to drive down their drive up their energy efficiency and therefore drive down their emissions. This makes sense not only from an emissions standpoint, but it also decreases their overall operating costs. And in times when commodity prices are where they are right now, which is not in a good place, that can be really beneficial and help increase those profit margins for producers that are often operating right on the margin. So that's one example of what folks are doing. I think there's a lot of other ones. We're seeing a lot with transit along the Front Range corridor. It depends on kind of what the focus is. As we know, Colorado is a pretty diverse state, and so it just depends on kind of your location and your hazards.
Great, thanks. Got a couple more questions that are coming in now. Looks like Joyce has a question. So in Fort Collins, please expand how you all engaged your other departments, and what's the directive from above generated from within or other? I think that's a pretty good question. I don't know if Katie and Lindsay are still on the phone. You can take a stab at that.
We sure are, Logan, and happy to speak to that. So I think in 2015, when we adopted the carbon neutrality goals, there was a real recognition that we were going to need all hands on deck in order to achieve those goals. And so that's where I mentioned earlier the formation of that leadership at all levels. And as soon as we had the commitment from the executive leaders, that CAP executive team that I mentioned, where our CSO sits next to our CFO, et cetera, that was really helpful to engaging all the other city departments too. And I would say that we have 11 teams, 70 city staff members that are touching this, 35 citizens that sit on those teams as well. And I think everybody was excited, honestly, to be a part of this, to be able to see how their work aligns into this broader area. So there wasn't necessarily a specific directive. I think it was framed as an opportunity, and people were excited to be able to see themselves within this work.
So from my perspective, because I've been working outside of a formal plan, I've really looked for it was pretty easy for utilities. They're often, our departments are used to worst case scenario planning. So it was, our utilities department's been really proactive. But I started to speak to individuals and look for champions within the organization. And they do a lot of the work for me in terms of developing capacity within their departments, talking to their managers. And you'd be surprised, there's a lot of employees that care about this. They feel a strong sense of professional responsibility in being involved in this type of work. So I think just starting to talk about it and seeing and learning a lot about where people are and what they're doing within the organization is really a great place to start.
Great. So is there any last questions to answer? Type them in now. We got 1 minute. To answer Bob's question, yes, we will make this presentation available. I will send a follow-up email with the with a PDF of all the slides, as well as a link to where the presentation will be on the Planning for Hazards website, and also the AICP-CM credit registration number as well for folks. So if there's any last questions, we're almost at time, and looks like nothing's coming in. So again, just want to thank our speakers today for sharing their expertise and offering support and providing that to any local government, community, anyone who's on the phone. I highly encourage you to reach out if you have any questions, either of the experts here. So for that, thank you all for tuning in, and I will send you a follow-up email with all these resources. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Logan, and everyone.